Welcome to the Washington Post newsroom. I'm Libby Casey, and I'm joined by three of our reporters, Greg Miller, Ellen Nakashima, and Adam Entis. They've got a big story this morning chronicling the Obama White House's attempts to figure out how to respond to Russian interference in the presidential election. Thank you so much to all three of you for coming in and talking with us. We're already getting questions coming in from people. I want to start with just the big headlines. So I want each of you to go through and tell us what's your big takeaway, your big headline from this story. Greg?
I'll start with where we started the whole story, which is just the early date in which the Obama White House first sees this breathtaking piece of intelligence that has Putin's direct involvement in this Russian operation. So early August, the White House gets an envelope delivered by courier from CIA, and inside is highly classified information. Only 4 people in the White House are allowed to even look at it. And it's all about, it's from sourcing deep inside the Russian government about Putin's direct involvement in this operation, and goes beyond that and says, this is the objective. It has Putin's instructions. Our purpose now, our goal is to try to hurt Hillary and to try to help elect Donald Trump.
Wow. We'll go through the timeline some more, but let's hear what your big takeaways are as well.
I would just say, like, to that point, even though that was very persuasive, that wasn't enough for Obama, right? He basically then says to the other intelligence chiefs, go out there and validate what the CIA just told me. He is so scared of looking like he's politicizing the intelligence. He is so scared of a repeat of WMD in Iraq. He wants to have bulletproof evidence that he can basically use internally to try to persuade members of Congress, that he can use publicly so that he doesn't look like he went off half-cocked. And so he basically tells these guys to go out there, get more intelligence, and as one would expect, it takes time. Other intelligence agencies are not on board as fast as Brennan, the CIA director at the time, is on board, because it's not coming from their sources. And so that helps explain why this is not so black and white. It is complicated. Obama wants to know that he's on solid ground, and that's he doesn't want to act prematurely in his mind. And a lot of people, though, can look and say, John Brennan is saying, we've got a smoking gun here, and yet other people can say, not so fast, we need more evidence.
And yet there were those within the administration who said, even without smoking gun evidence that Putin himself wanted Trump to win, there was still enough evidence, there was hard evidence that Russia itself had hacked the DNC. They were fairly convinced that they were behind this interference campaign to sow discord and doubt around the election itself. And there was pressure to do something before the election, to come out publicly and say Russia was behind this campaign of interference. And some people also wanted to take response actions, to do something to punish Russia, to prevent it from doing something even worse, like maybe actually altering the vote tallies.
That's a key point. I mean, it starts off by hacking the DNC emails. Those get released. It does sow a bit of chaos into the Hillary Clinton campaign. But as you mentioned, Alan, there was a concern from your reporting that the Russians could do more. How much did that really weigh into this decision? If we retaliate, we then ramp things up, and there can be an escalation.
I think that was a huge factor from the very beginning, and we quote Obama's Chief of Staff, Dennis McDonough, basically making that point. Their first priority and highest principle was to safeguard the election in November. They wanted that to go off without a hitch, and every decision they made was to that end. And so all of their debates were, in addition to being worried about being perceived as politicizing all of this, were if we act, what will that mean? How might Russia retaliate? What would that mean for the security of the election? And ultimately, I think that's part of why they decide we're not going to risk it before the election. Whatever we do is going to have to wait until afterward.
And you guys point out, you take us back to this time a year ago when there was the assumption that Hillary Clinton would win. The assumption by Washington insiders, by the White House, by journalists, by many Americans, that Hillary Clinton would win this campaign. So there wasn't a sense of urgency to clear this up before the election.
That's right. Yeah. Donald Trump himself expected he would lose, and he was constantly saying the election was rigged in the summer, last summer. And so the White House was also reluctant or afraid to do anything that might give him ammunition to say, you see, the election was rigged.
So after the election, Donald Trump loses, and then he can say, "Oh, look, we held this evidence that Russia was interfering. These votes can't be trusted." What is the feeling from the White House officials now, looking back on some of the decisions they made, Adam?
Well, I think they obviously a lot of people feel like they dropped the ball. Others who were involved in all the complex decisions that had to be made feel like they had to balance the pros and the cons. And so, they erred on the side of deterrence initially, and then basically came to bring retaliation of a modest type later. I think when you look at the nature of the retaliation, one of the takeaways again from the story is, it's sort of like an iceberg, right? That what you see on the top is the smallest part, right? That would be the sanctions. And part of the story here is really the bottom part of the iceberg that's beneath the surface of the water. It's the covert action. There's a little bit that was done that we've described in the story, which was basically a display of capability, if you will, where we basically we showed them by tweaking something, we don't really know exactly what they tweaked, to show that we could do that. And then more importantly, the signing of a covert finding, which allowed the CIA, NSA, and Cyber Command to begin placing time bombs of a cyber variety, which could be used in the future to try to retaliate against the Russians if we have another standoff like this again. That's a sort of an example of where, that's something obviously Obama cannot point to that publicly, because that's the whole point of doing a covert action. But that is also something that now we're able to explain, at least in some detail, in the story, although we really, to this moment, do not really understand the scope of that and how it would work in the future.
Certainly seems there's a before and after period, before the election and after the election, because before the election, as you report, the White House is struggling with how to respond, what to do publicly, what to do covertly, and then after the election, there's a whole different calculation they have to make of what wheels to put in motion, what to say publicly. So take us back to last summer, before the election. How was the Obama administration working through this? How are they trying to talk to Capitol Hill and show people this intelligence?
Well, there was a series of meetings that started to take place in the White House and actually amongst other agencies, where you had at sort of mid-level, you had policy officials at the DOD, DHS, FBI, Justice Department, State Department, around the government, trying to come up with potential options to respond to Russia, to deter or to punish them for their actions. And they came up with dozens of potential responses, everything from really forceful sort of sector-wide economic sanctions that could really take a dent out of Russia's economy, to diplomatic, publicly calling out Russia, naming and shaming them, to cyber actions that might disrupt a network in Moscow. And these options kept getting pushed up to the senior levels of the White House, to the National Security Advisor, the Chief of Staff, and at some point these options, the lower level people kept feeling like they weren't really getting much traction. They weren't getting a response back from the senior levels of the White House that these were options that they wanted to push forward with.
And one of the dynamics that helps account for that, and we explain in the story, is that because of how sensitive some of this intelligence was, all of the deliberations were so closely held. Initially, there were only 4 senior national security officials allowed even to be read into the intelligence, to be involved in the initial deliberations. That circle widens, but there's always a wall, there's always a layer beneath the highest level officials who are never really sure what's happening in those cabinet level meetings. What are they thinking? What are their plans? And what decisions are they going to make?
And so what comes from this?
Well, I mean, the compartmentalization, which is what we're describing, is so, after 9/11, there was an effort to try to create the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence. The goal was to stop that siloing of information so the people at the top can basically see everything in order to make decisions. Well, what happens in this case is very similar to that, in the sense that, again, very compartmentalized. The goal here is to protect the sources of this information. That would be the top priority for the CIA. They want to keep getting information, and so that's their priority. And so you can see why that would you know, if everybody is protecting their information, everybody is trying to protect their equities, if you will, that would make it harder to reach a consensus on a path forward. And I think in many ways, there's a quote in the story from Ben Rhodes, who's the former Deputy National Security Advisor, in which he says effectively that the Russians were playing this wider game, but the way this compartmentalization worked, you know, the White House viewed it first as a cyber threat. They didn't really see the scope of what the Russians were doing effectively until it was too late. And by that time, the damage was done, and they were basically in kind of cleanup mode. And that's where I think, you know, when we do talk about the retaliation after the election, one of the most important things that Obama does is direct the intelligence community to take all the intelligence about what Russia did, put it together in a report, and have a public version of that released. So no matter, you know, that sort of, in many ways, may be the most important thing that happens here, because obviously it ties Trump's hands with regard to Russia in a big way, and it makes it almost impossible for Russia to get what it hoped out of this, which was improving relations with the United States, because it made it very political, very difficult for Trump to maneuver. And I think in many ways that, I know that's not one of the sanctions, but it has an effect like a sanction, which in some ways may be the most lasting impact that this has, because we're having this discussion, and next election, we're all going to be asking this question: did Russia intervene?
Karen writes in on Facebook and says, wasn't he, the President Obama, stuck between a rock and a hard place? If he did more, it would have looked like he was helping Hillary Clinton. Absolutely.
I mean, that was a huge factor for the White House. They were worried for good reason. Trump, by early August, is already saying, this election is rigged. It's going to be rigged. You watch how I'm going to get screwed over here. And so the Obama officials were really worried about playing into that, about being perceived as putting their thumb on the scales, because at the time, the overwhelming assumption is that Clinton is going to win. And one of the potential downsides is if they act and they get this perception, then they could be contaminating this assumed Clinton victory. And there's also an assumption when the next administration will be very like-minded with ours. She served in Obama's cabinet. There's plenty of time here to work through these issues.
So one of the things they tried to do at this point in time was get a bipartisan statement of support from the Hill to both call out Russia publicly and say Russia was behind this interference campaign, and also to get the Congress bipartisan leaders to encourage the local and state election officials to avail themselves of help from the Department of Homeland Security to make sure their election systems were protected. And for the bipartisan efforts kind of failed. It broke down into squabbles, and in the end, they could not get that bipartisan statement that they wanted. And so instead, two senior Democratic leaders of Congress, the Democratic ranking member on the House Intelligence Committee and the ranking member on the Senate Intelligence Committee, put out their own statement of attribution of sorts at the end of September, publicly naming Russia as behind this campaign.
Resistance from Republicans, what can you tell us about that?
Yes, the Republican leadership very much resisted this. In fact, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, was doubting even that there was evidence that Russia was really behind this campaign. He was like, show us the proof. And whereas the Democrats really felt like this was, this was clear and we should get the statement out. That
political battle goes on today. I mean, I saw one of you guys on television this morning on CNN, and right after you, a Republican commentator came on and said, I see no evidence, I see no proof. We've had President Trump on the campaign trail, hypothesizing that hackers could be a 400-pound guy in New Jersey. So tell us about the chain of proof and what we know, linking this to not just Russia and Russian hackers, but President Vladimir Putin.
So that linkage has been asserted by the U.S. government for quite some time now. I mean, dating back to October 7th, that was the very first public statement that alludes to Putin's involvement. It doesn't name him, but says this is something that an operation of this nature has to come from the highest levels of the Russian government. That is spelled out in a lot more detail in the January report that the administration releases. But what our story now helps fill in a lot of the gaps here, a lot of the detail. Where did that initial kernel of intelligence come from? And it all goes back to this CIA material that comes out of the Russian government that captures Putin's own instructions on this operation, right? His fingerprints on it.
What is his goal? I mean, it may seem obvious what the goal would be to meddle or interfere in the U.S. election, but what is the goal? What do we know?
The goal is basically to say that the United States is not exceptional and that Russia should not be looked at as worse than the United States, that we are basically two systems that may have differences, but one is not better than the other. That would be the goal. It's a zero-sum game. The goal is basically to bring the United States down, and therefore Russia looks better. That would be I think the underlying objective here of this operation, just like previous operations that have been conducted by Russia. What's different in this case is that they did what a lot of governments do, what the United States government does, which is basically steal inside information, and then they took this extraordinary step of taking that and re-injecting it back into the public dialogue here to basically balkanize, increase the balkanization of our political landscape, which was already balkanized, but make it even worse in order to basically make it so that down the road we're not going to, half the country is not going to trust the FBI, half the country's not going to trust the intelligence agencies anymore. They're not going to trust that their elections are actually secure. It's basically undermining the systems that we have taken for granted in this country. It really is quite scary when you think of how, in such a short period of time, we really just don't know what to believe anymore in the country. And that was the goal, and they've been remarkably successful in carrying out this operation in this way.
I would just add on that that is to me probably the most lasting impact. I mean, we're just only beginning to come to grips with the extent of that sort of damage. There's just sort of a reputational damage to these institutions that we thought were secure and protected. There's another motive, though, for Putin here that goes beyond just trying to drag down the United States. He has almost a personal animosity toward Hillary Clinton. He, long before this election, accused her, firmly believed that she was behind uprisings in Russia, protests against Putin's own government. And he sees this behavior, I mean, he sees what Russia did last year is sort of equivalent to what the United States does. He actually believes that the United States is constantly playing these sort of global political games and never gets blamed for it the way that Russia does. And this was a chance to sort of turn about being fair play.
We have a question coming in from Nancy who asks, how can we ever be sure that our voting process is free of interference? Which gets to the question that you raised, Adam, of Americans suddenly lacking trust in things like the electoral system. So what do you guys have to say for Nancy's response?
No, I mean, absolutely. In this case, in this election, there was no interference, or no actual altering
Changing
of
of
vote
vote tallies,
right,
as far as evidence has shown so far.
There were efforts. I mean, we just heard this week, Department of DHS senior officials saying that there were attempts in 21 states to actually get into some systems, voter registration systems. They were not, in the main, successful. One DHS official told us that there was really only one state in which they actually confirmed evidence of Russian compromise, and that was in Illinois. But there were no successful efforts to actually change the outcome of the votes. However, there's always the fear that going forward, Russia can become more sophisticated in its efforts to hack into these systems and figure out which ones they may have to actually affect down to the county level, the state level, in order to, if there's a really, really close election, to maybe just change enough votes that could make a difference.
Was this a dry run, basically? They obviously were very effective at taking emails and using fake news to try to undermine one candidate and boost another.
We haven't even talked about fake news, but that was an aspect of this.
Right, yeah, absolutely. And then, now going forward, you could see the Russians potentially try to, up the ante next time and go down this other road, or frankly, it doesn't have to be the Russians. It could be another government that has a sophisticated service or that could hire with enough cash people to basically carry out similar type operations. So we're basically kind of entering a new world, where we just don't know what's going to happen next, and whether or not people can have faith in the future that there's not going to be an attempt to try to interfere with the actual voting next time.
Maria writes in on Facebook and says, okay, so now I want to know what President Trump did after he received the information. So can you take us through, we talked about last summer, we talked about the election comes and goes, and President Obama has some brand new choices to make about how to move forward with his short remaining time in office. What do we know about how President Trump has picked up this ball? According to Clapper, who was the outgoing, was the director of national intelligence, he was the one who went to Trump Tower along with Comey and others to present him with this intelligence, including what we are revealing in the story, albeit, I assume, in greater detail than we're revealing about specifically what did Putin order and how the nature of the sourcing with which the CIA based that initial assessment. And so he, according to Clapper, was impressed. And there were some initial signs immediately after that briefing that maybe he accepted Russia's role in this. Since then, there's been certainly mixed messages coming from him, bordering on dismissal, like we saw earlier on. So I think maybe Clapper made the case, and he was somewhat convinced at that point. But you can see the skepticism, or at least the skepticism that he wants his base and others to see is out there again on display in some of his tweets and public comments.
Yeah, so as you say, this is a ball that the Obama administration is handing off to Trump, and for all appearances, this is a ball that Donald Trump wants nothing to do with, right? There's no indication that they have any appetite for revisiting punitive measures against Russia, for revisiting or further investigating the interference in the election last year. And one of the weird little things that we surface in our story, Adam was talking early on in the conversation about this covert measure that Obama sets in motion, which is basically to set the stage for some future date. If there is a cyber escalation with Russia, the United States would have weapons at its disposal. But those are now weapons in Donald Trump's hands. Those are now in the Trump administration's hands. So if those are going to be used anytime in the next 4 years, it would be Trump pulling the trigger.
Mm-hmm. We've heard from Sean Spicer, press secretary, recently in a briefing that he just hadn't checked in with President Trump about his opinion on this matter. Has there been any evolution even in the last couple of weeks from the Trump team about his response to this?
He's obviously fixated on the narrative, and the narrative particularly that the FBI is investigating him for possible obstruction, possible collusion with the Russians, and that seems to be his main focus, rather than the underlying issue here, which is what happened in 2016, what should be done to make sure it doesn't happen again. It seems like his focus is on the narrative.
He just tweeted out yesterday, was it, that Russian meddling was all a Democratic hoax.
Right.
Okay, so some people are writing in and saying this story is fake news. How do you guys counter that and focus on your reporting and sort of do your job in the midst of that noise?
We continue to do our reporting and put out the news that we believe to be true. And
it's obviously this has become something that we've again part of the new landscape. We get these messages all the time now.
It's a refrain.
Yeah, and it's obviously very concerning for us because we try to spend so much time and agonizing over making sure that what we're reporting is accurate, and for it to be so easily dismissed and not knowing if that person's a real person or if that person is a troll or if that person is being encouraged by again the balkanization where everybody's turning to the channel that is saying what they want to hear. Yeah. That is obviously, it's just very disheartening. You can turn on Fox and listen to the Trump interview this morning, or you can watch CNN, which is reporting on the Washington Post story, and Fox doesn't touch on that story. And so, I mean, this is again just exactly what Russia was hoping for. It's, I'm sure, even more than they had hoped for. That we are so divided internally, and as we're divided, we're weaker, and that's when adversaries find safe harbor and an opportunity to attack the United States.
Let me try a slightly more direct response, though. I mean, I would just point out that the Washington Post and other major news organizations have century-plus-old reputations, right, behind all of this reporting. And the stories, this story today is the latest in a whole sequence and series of stories that this team has done, the national security staff at the Washington Post has done, most of which have all been confirmed by the reporting of other news organizations, right? There is, these stories are holding up one after the other, one after the other.
Final question before I let you go. Alex writes in, okay, so how do we fix this? Now, we are not looking to you guys to be the problem solvers here, you're the journalists, but as you talk to people in the national security community, people who have overseen some of this process in the past couple of years, what are their thoughts on moving forward?
One of the big antidotes to Russian or any influence campaign is to raise public awareness, to make sure they understand what's going on, who's doing it, and why, and that is part of what we're doing. That is what we tried to do with this story, number one. One of the challenges to what Russia is doing, which is basically weaponizing information, it's a form of information warfare, is that the U.S. government is loath to engage in similar tactics. Like, for instance, one of the options they did discuss over the summer was perhaps releasing embarrassing financial information on Russian oligarchs or on Putin himself. But the White House determined that doing so would sort of lower themselves to Russia's level. They weren't going to engage in sort of similar tactics. So if we are not willing to do the same to them, I mean, we have to, the best way to counter that, I think, is by arming the people with information so they can really make the best judgments as to who's saying what and why.
And frankly, like with homegrown terrorism, if you will, like every time there's another shooting at the schools, for example, we keep on thinking, oh, there's going to be some policy changes that come out of these school shootings to try to address this, underlying problem. And, we have this discussion in the newsroom every time there is one of these moments, and the editor will say, well, is this a turning point? And we all, those of us that have been around, seen this over and over again, we are all actually know there isn't going to be a change. This may very well fit into that category where even though this was obviously a huge event that occurred, it may not be a big enough event to actually galvanize enough of the divided leadership of this country to make a change. And so we might see this happen repeatedly before there is that consensus behind changing things, because changing things requires compromise, and the multiple sides here are not prepared to work together to that end.
Thank you so much to all three of you, Adam Entous, Ellen Nakashima, and Greg Miller. Of course, you can find their reporting at WashingtonPost.com, and here if you're watching on Facebook, right as we have this conversation. I'm Libby Casey. Thank you for watching. Thanks, guys.